Okay, everyone, this is lecture 8.1, Prisons and Families. The prison system is a really very complex series of social problems. And I actually do teach an entire course for University of New Mexico just on the prison system and those issues. But in this lecture, we will be talking specifically about how the prison system impacts families. So we're going to talk about that background for a second. Then we'll talk about the secondary impacts of incarceration. We'll then talk about how that impacts certain racial communities. We'll talk about prisons as a total institution. And actually, I'll be giving you your prompts in Learn itself. We won't be discussing the prompts directly. So let's talk about some of that background. The prison system in the United States as it exists is almost fundamentally flawed. There are some elements to it that work, but the vast majority of the system as it exists does not work. The United States has the largest proportion of its population in prison in the world. 4.4%, almost 5% of the U.S. population is in prison at any given time. And 22% of the total prisoners in the world are imprisoned in the United States. And as a society that values freedom, those are some damning statistics. The disproportionate number of people in the prisons, there are a disproportionate number of African Americans in the prison system compared to other groups. African Americans in the year 2018 make up about 12% of the total U.S. population. But African Americans make up about 33% of the total prison population. That is an indicator that there's a major problem with the way the system operates. And like I said, I would discuss this in detail in a prisons class, but for this lecture, we're going to focus on families. But that says, though, that the impact on African American families is disproportionately large on what prison does to those families. Additionally, prisons lack rehabilitation and education programs. Prisons in this country, other prisons have those programs, we do not. And private prisons are particularly heinous institutions because they operate off of a profit motive, right? So they treat prisoners in a way that, regardless of what their crimes are inhumane, that most people would not consider fit to treat dogs. And anyway, like I said, I talk about all these in my prisons class. Additionally, there are gender problems. Women are treated worse in prisons than men are treated. A lot of those are actually based on intentions of treating women equally, but it has actually the impact of treating women worse. So, for example, they want to treat women the same as men, so because they're treating women the same as men, they don't give women access to tampons because men don't have access to tampons, right? It's just that kind of madness endemic in the system. As you can tell, I'm kind of passionate about that topic. So let's talk specifically about how prisons impact families and communities. These are known as the secondary impacts of incarceration. So the secondary impacts of incarceration are the ways that our society, that the world is impacted when we put people in prison. So we have empty apartments. There are landlords, there are other people that, that space is not being occupied. And that has impacts on communities. There are missing workers, right? So when someone's put in prison, there's a loss of economic productivity. We have missing community members, right? Whether that person was a good person or bad person, they aren't there to help their community when they need it. And if they were a particularly bad person, maybe they weren't participating in their community. But if they were maybe a heroin addict, maybe they were also helping their community. They were just also addicted to heroin. We have people who are missing friends, missing their elderly people that are missing their children, right? Even if those children have problems. We have missing spouses, and possibly most powerfully, we have missing parents, right? A lot of us have parents that weren't necessarily the best parents, but they were our parents. And when those parents are missing during childhood, that is particularly troubling. So at any given time, there are 2.3% of children under 18 that have had a parent in prison. So that is 1.7 million children in the United States have had their parents missing for a portion of their childhood because they are in prison. And there's a much greater than those who have never. Wait, 1 second. Much greater than those who have had. That should say never. Sorry, who have never had a parent in prison, right? So if your parent has been in prison because of recidivism rates, because of the way the system is set up, people who commit crime tend to commit crimes over again and tend to get caught. That means that if your parent has been in prison once, you stand a far greater chance of your parent going back to prison. So it might not just be that they were missing for 3 years when you were a little kid. Maybe they're missing for 3 years and then another 5 years when you're also a teenager, and that can have compounding issues. Let's talk about some of the race implications in relation to the family. I addressed there is hyper-incarceration of certain populations, so that's a disproportionate incarceration of given portions of the population by class. So working class and middle class and poor people are more likely to wind up in prison, largely because they can't afford good lawyers. Second, by race. So we have, I'm just pulling these off the top of my head, these are approximate. I believe it's 33% of the population is black in our prisons, 33% is white, and about, I think 25% is Latino. So it's disproportionate. 60 to 65% of our population is white. If there were not racial issues with the prison system, we would expect 65% of the prison population to also be white. The fact of the matter is that we put people in minority populations in prison more often. It's not that people in those populations are more prone to crime, they are more prone to getting caught. And third is by location. If you live in the city, you're more likely to be imprisoned. If you live in the country, you're less likely to be imprisoned. And a lot of that has to do with funding of law enforcement and the number of police and their ability to catch people. So, what impact does hyper-incarceration relating to race have on African American children? Studies were done that children born in 1990, African American children that were born in 1990, had a 25% chance of having their father incarcerated before they were 14. White children of the same demographic, other than race, had a 3.6% chance. That is a colossal difference, right? And that's not just a major impact on those children, it's a major impact on the communities, right? So it's not just talking about fathers, it's talking about missing uncles, missing church members, missing community members, missing neighbors, right? It's a devastating impact on the African American community. I mentioned African American community, African American families, so the psyches of children. It has an impact on the relationship between African Americans and the criminal justice system, right? If you see police come and take your father away and taking people out of your community, then you will come to see the police as the bad guys. And that has a cyclical relationship, right? If you see the police as the bad guys, you might start seeing the law as being bad, and you might be more prone to doing crime then, right? All things that are tied to labeling theory within sociology. And it also, so outside of the African American community, impacts our understanding between racial groups. So different experiences can result in a lack of understanding between whites and blacks, right? So white people are more prone to seeing cops as the good guys. Black people are more likely to see not necessarily cops as the bad guys, but as cops not always being the good guys. And those differences in perception can lead to differences in perception of social movements. So social movements like Black Lives Matter and other social movements that defend the African American community can be villainized by those that aren't in that community because they don't understand the arguments, because they don't have the same life experiences. Let's talk about prison as a social institution. Total institution. A total institution is a social institution that attempts to control all aspects of people in its control. So examples of social total institutions include prisons, include the military, include rehabilitation programs, and include cults. So the military and rehab, they aren't trying to do it for really a bad purpose, but they're trying to do it for a specific purpose, right? Boot camp is trying to turn you into a soldier. Rehab is trying to turn you into a not addicted person, and they do that by controlling all elements of your personality for a period of time. Prison has its issues. Cults are certainly trying to do it to dominate you, but all of them have the impact of bringing you into their control. And within total institutions, we have the process of resocialization, which is learning to operate in a new social setting. So when someone is resocialized, it tends to be a very dramatic process through which we start going by new names, right? So in the prison system, prisoners are required to go by their numbers, right? So you're prison 4513 as opposed to being Jerry, right? Or something like that, right? A new name is a big part of total institutions. You have to learn how to behave in the prison. You have to learn what behaviors will get you punished by other inmates, what behaviors will get you punished by prison guards, what are the rules, how do I take a shower, how do I eat, how do I exist, right? That is a resocialization process. And this resocialization process impacts not only prisoners, but also people who have relationships with prisoners, as is explained and explored in our reading for this week. And I'll touch briefly on that before I let you go to your other studies for this class. Secondary prisonization is what we are exploring in our reading. So that secondary prisonization is a term for the impact of imprisonment on the lives of those with relationships with prisoners. Your text calls these people quasi-inmates, right? So the wives, the girlfriends, the children, the friends of those who are imprisoned also suffer because of the prisonization. And it changes schedules, work schedules, it changes times off. People might even change their job or where they live so that they can still maintain their relationship with the person that's in prison. And this creates a phenomenon known as prison as a domestic satellite, also explored in your reading, where the prison becomes a place that is home, right? And creates those visiting areas where visitors are allowed to visit their loved ones who are in prison. That creates them to make them more domestic and more socially domestic, and where the experience that happens in the home can happen in those visiting areas. And that is a very interesting phenomena, and it really is a way of understanding the secondary prisonization phenomena. Okay, that will do it for this week. That'll set you up for what you need for the readings and our various assignments. And yeah, this is an interesting topic. It's troubling, but I think you'll probably find it interesting.